Welcome, my name's Stephen Jardine and it's my pleasure to be your host this afternoon. We're really happy to have you all with us, joining from wherever you are. Maggie's can only carry on doing the work that they do thanks to the support of corporate partners. And right now, of course, that has never been more important. So we're really grateful for all the support you give to Maggie's as an organisation. As you know, Maggie supports people with cancer and their friends and family in centres across the UK and abroad. And that work's had to change and adapt to meet the challenges of the pandemic. One of the issues for Maggie's over the course of the last 12 months has been maintaining support for people with social distancing, with home working in place. And the organisation has adapted to that, significantly expanding online activity. As part of that, with the really generous support of our friends and partners at the People's Postcode Lottery, we staged a couple of virtual events, one of them talking about living with cancer during a pandemic, and the other focusing on just juggling home, family life, illness as well. Today, we're focusing on returning to the workplace after lockdown. At Maggie's, the staff are specially trained to help people cope with the most challenging circumstances and situations that life can throw at them. So we're going to tap into that expertise this afternoon as we all face the uncertainty of returning to the workplace after a year safe and sound at home. I'm going to be joined by two key members of staff from Maggie's this afternoon to help us do that. And there'll be plenty of time, of course, to ask any questions and raise any points at the end. Just use the Q&A function on your screen for that. Just click and type. So what a year it's been for all of us. A few of us in the workplace, most of us working from home, all of us working differently, I guess. 6 months ago, a survey showed only 12% of people want to return to full-time office work after the pandemic. 72% want that kind of hybrid working. And of course, that's now translating into reality. PwC, the accountancy giant, was early out of the blocks last month, announcing staff would return to the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week, finishing at lunchtime, all of them on Fridays. BP have announced a 60-40 split, returning to home and office working, and more companies are now coming up with their plans. The approaches might all be different, but the message is the same. There will be some kind of workplace moving forward, but there will be home working as well. And with that's going to come issues. So this afternoon, here to help us with that, two special guests. We're joined by Lesley Howells, Maggie's lead psychologist. Afternoon, Lesley.
Hi there.
And Lisa Evans, occupational therapist at Maggie's Manchester. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, nice to be here.
Good to see you too. We're going to hear from them individually, and then together at the end, they'll be answering your questions. So once again, just use that Q&A function that you've got on your Zoom screen to send the questions in now. We'll pile them all up and we'll deal with them at the end. So we're going to start with you, Lesley, and the big issue of how you can support employees as they return to the workplace in the weeks and months ahead. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you to the People's Postcode Lottery for enabling this and many other things within our Maggie's experience, and welcome to everybody who's here as well. Hopefully, what we offer is something which is pragmatic and really you can put into place almost immediately. And we'll be talking not just about your employees, but we'll also be talking about you as well. So first things first, I will share my screen and the prepared slides. What I have been aware of, and no doubt you guys as well, has been just the amount of media attention that's been out there. It's been extraordinary. It's been coming in from our usual newspaper channels. It's come in online. It's come in from professional bodies like the British Psychological Society, Harvard Business Review, King's Fund, across the way, around how do you dust off your social skills, how do you deal with somebody who doesn't want to come back to work, and also this thing around brain fog after being in isolation or more or less isolation for all of us over this period of time. What's it going to be like in terms of what's it taxing our bodies? So I'm interested, and Stephen's interested, and we're all interested in terms of this is what the media is saying. But what have you been noticing with your employees? And we wondered whether we could do a quick poll now, just to get your thoughts on what you've been noticing in your workplace.
Just running through the questions for everyone. What's the biggest concern among colleagues about returning to the office? Social distancing when you get there, social distancing on the bus, the train to get there, the commute, social anxieties after working at home for so long, managing that work-life balance, family stuff, Lesley, stamina to cope with that long day with the commute as well, reduced confidence. That's interesting, isn't it? After working from home for so long, what do you talk to colleagues about? How do you talk to clients as well? The practicalities of doing that job again in the office and not in the way we've been doing it. Or are you not worried at all?
Okay.
Those are the questions.
So I think the poll should start appearing. Here it goes.
That's really interesting. So it is that work-life balance stuff. So the top three, work-life balance, well, in first place, and then joint second really is that social distancing and the commute and social anxieties after working at home for so long, just those water cooler moments, I guess, Lesley. And but it's reverberating back to the home when you're taken out of being part of the school run maybe again, when you're not there to support around the home with your partner. How's that going to impact on relationships? That's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I thought it's really interesting. It is actually interesting what you guys have said, because in the best way, I have kind of been capturing in from research and from other kind of sources to see not just what you've been seeing, but what others have been doing. And so very much I'll just close that poll now. So that anxiety around being close to people again, even literally, many people will be aware that in the media that there have been comments on the fact that we are showering less frequently now, and that the amount of deodorant that everybody's using has gone down. So the idea of being actually close to people and is something that's causing some people anxiety, and also that idea of a loss of confidence. As soon as you're human beings, we're so habitual, we get used to things, and as soon as we're taken out of those settings that we're used to, then we tend to lose confidence. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not easy to build that confidence again, but it's worth noticing. So noticing confidence around social chit chat again, or will we be talking about baking programs at the water cooler again or not? But also confidence in terms of their work tasks, just kind of getting ourselves back up and running again and feeling comfortable and smooth in terms of how we operate in the workplace rather than at home. And also, one of the things that's been coming up is that this has been an almighty pause for all of us. And so a loss of confidence really in terms of future career aspirations. And also, as I'll talk about, actually revising in your own mind your future career aspirations. Another thing that's out there in terms of the research is this feeling of overwhelm physically, and this is something which will be really interesting for everybody to notice, is that just sensory overload, like instead of having the kind of confines of your house, the noises that were just part of the backdrop before suddenly become a part of this kind of bombard of stimuli. And I know that my colleague Lisa will comment on that later on. But also psychologically, the overwhelm, and my role is to really focus in on that in the next stage of my presentation. But also there is something which is really, really important, and I'm sure you've noticed it as well, is there's this kind of societal wish to think, right, how do we respond to the horrors of this year? Respond with resilience and actually grow through it all. How do we grow psychologically given what we've had to kind of move with over this period of time? So what I'd like to do is just offer a metaphor that we use every day within our centres. And this is with people who basically, it's anybody going through a traumatic, unexpected change. And it's as if through our lives, we build together, we piece together this elaborate and really well-crafted jigsaw of how we have our life in front of us. Where of our family, where is our home life, where is the leisure, what are the things that we like to do, where do we place our work in relation to this jigsaw? And it's as if whenever something traumatic, and that can be cancer, or indeed it can be simply COVID, comes in, it's as if it goes underneath that jigsaw, that trauma goes underneath and just throws everything up in the air. The jigsaw's pieces are just all over the place, and it can be overwhelming just to see that happen. And we all experienced that last March, and then intermittently at end of the year as we went through transition. But it's overwhelming when the pieces go up in the air, but it's equally overwhelming when we're starting to put them back in place. And this is where the importance of how we actually help our employees to put those back in place, and help them, bring some loyalty to them in terms of, we know this is a transition, how can we help you? And so what I'll do is now run through the ways in which we can help people just piece those bits back together again. And sometimes work might not actually be the center point that it was before. And how do we help them to navigate that space? So when anybody's going through transition, and that's the transition of the jigsaw going up in the air, but it's also the transition of it coming back down as we go back into the workplace. Human beings go through very, very typical emotions, and it's worth noticing them and not reacting to them, seeing them for what they are. They are part of a natural process. So there will be emotions around, this is unreal, this is shock, it's numb, or testing out new perspective, or fear, or anxiety, or feelings of uncertainty. There will be feelings of hopelessness, and there will be feelings of anger or blame. Those are part of being human and going through stuff. And we go through it, and the important thing is not to get kind of holding on to any of those kind of juggling emotions for too long. So for example, not going hold on to some sort of obsessing around anxiety about socially going back into the workplace, or indeed kind of getting caught up in anger of changes that might have happened in terms of your work role, or even despair or hopelessness around, is this where I want my life to be going right now? So these, first and foremost, these are natural, so look out for them. And also, one of the things that I wanted to come in, and I'm a psychologist, I'm going to bring in psychological concepts. And one of them is the idea of, we can go through, and many of you will know, post-traumatic stress is something that we're aware of. And in many respects, people will have gone through traumatic incidents during this year, which will leave some elements of that post-traumatic stress. But there is this concept called post-traumatic growth. And if we bring the right support around a person, then that post-traumatic growth is optimized. And this particular metaphor comes from a Japanese beautiful craftsmanship, which is when something is broken. So a piece of porcelain or a piece of pot is broken, right? Don't leave the pieces scattered. Don't put it back together with Gorilla Glue in whatever shape or form. If you have got the opportunity of build something back again and growing through something, build it back with gold, make it even better than it was before. Okay. So on that note, I'll now go through some of the ways in which you can actually support your employee to build themselves back and make that naturally tricky, but can be smooth transition. And one of them is to manage overwhelm, right? And I'm just going to very briefly move through pause, reach out, open to change, and routine. Nothing you won't have heard before, but it's worth actually just kind of putting it into this context of why these elements are important in terms of helping your employee to manage just whatever level of overwhelm they feel as they come through the door and back into workplace. So to pause. So many of us, and this, I'm always drawing on from material that we work with everyday folk through our centres. So a pause. Now, a pause is to anchor ourselves in the here and now, rather than get swept away with all the troubling stuff that might be going on in our heads, right? And often when we're going through things, it can feel like our brains are like this shook up snow globe with all sorts of swirling blizzard, and it is not the best place to actually make decisions. And so the pause enables people to just kind of settle, to let the blizzard in their mind settle, so that they've got some clear space to choose how they want to respond to whatever situation is in front of them, rather than, as I say, react and get swept away by difficult emotions. And feeling fearful in the middle of all we've gone through is normal. And the trick is to pause, expect what's going to happen. So expect some of those natural emotions, expect to be bewildered to a certain extent, let it ebb and flow, not get entangled in them. But what's a pause? A pause is quite simply, it can be a taking note of your breath. It can be looking up and noticing what you've never noticed before. And there's loads out there, and we'll send you extra information in the takeaway of what a pause means. And it can be simply just kind of just so good to take a breath, to just kind of let things settle. Because research says, okay, that if you let an emotion sit there without fueling it for 90 seconds, it will ebb. So why don't you give that a try? Okay, so pause 90 seconds and let it ebb. The other kind of top tip in terms of how to help support your employees is to really encourage them to reach out. And I don't mean this in a glib way, oh, reach out, kind of connect. It is actually resilience in tough times. It's all about asking for help. It's reaching out, just like we would encourage anybody to do who's going through difficulty, friends, family, and to share the worries with people you can trust, and to actually believe that when a manager is offering you a trusted conversation, that that's really what's going to be offered, and that you can actually speak out. Because if you share, you model sharing to others who might be more reticent. I know that I'm tight for time, so I'll kind of move my way through this, and you will have these notes to refer to later on. The other is being open to change. And this is at the heart of resilience as well, and bouncing back. It's that idea of that jigsaw has gone up in the air. If we want it back absolutely spot on how it was before, we're on a hiding to nothing. We're just going to burden ourselves with extra suffering. The best thing to do is actually think, right, how do I move with it? What are the things that I can change? And what I can't do. And using our values, these values that we have at the heart of us are our compass for deciding, right, given the situation that I find myself in at the moment, and given my value of professionalism, integrity, honesty, how do I respond to this situation? How do I actually alert somebody to the fact that I'm finding this transition difficult? Or how do I just adapt to finding this is where I am, I have to find my way through this, and I can do. So that openness to change rather than hold on to a rigid expectation of how things should be. Last, in terms of the employee, is routine. And this is just, again, the idea that when we are in the midst of uncertainty, and that's the actual moving back into the workplace, this is moving out, which we did last year. Routine is a certainty when other things are uncertain. So having those and Lisa will bring that in later as well. So where you can build certainty, and routine is one of them, build it, okay? But also the other thing is the idea of modeling resilience. And this is where it comes to you in terms of really reflecting on what you can be modeling in terms of that adaptability, in terms of that open to change, in terms of those routines and those pauses. And there are two things, if nothing else, please take these away from you. So Einstein ever comes out with some extraordinary things, not just mass formulation. It's the strongest of the species that's advised is not the most intelligent, which is reassuring, but the one that's most responsive to change, who can move with reality, who isn't rigid and contracted and wanting things to be as they were. It's very much that they move, they kind of allow for unexpected change, allow for disappointment, but actually keep their heads high, see what's important to them as their focus, and find their way through. Yeah. But the other thing that we know, and we know it in Maggie's every single day, and I'm sure you will have come across the Maya Angelou quote, because you can't hear it often enough. And it's very humbling. People will forget what you've said. So you'll forget what I said. You may forget what I have done in this webinar, but hopefully you will never forget how I made you feel. And if you can bring that into your leadership style, that is something that can really change. And I don't wish to be patronizing in any shape or form. This is just a really salient reminder of what is at the heart of human relationships. So let me move through the top reminders of resilient leadership, and you will be aware of that the self-awareness stuff that's come out in terms of leadership over the last years has been extraordinary, and I've just broken it down into kind of 5 pairings in these top 10. So we've got noticing, then this is a self-awareness about noticing what triggers you. Okay, and noticing that when you're noticing what triggers you, it's how do you kind of adapt and allow for those difficult emotions that are being triggered, let them ebb, stay present, stay open, right, such that you can pause to choose how to respond to whatever your, oh sorry, that's my own pause. Sorry, right, that's life, isn't it? Right, I'll try not to throw it across the rest of the room, but I was just trying to be mindful of time. So pause, that was a useful pause for me. Pause to choose how to respond to whatever your employee is bringing to you in line with your values rather than to react. And I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. And it is an art form. It's people go on very lengthy mindfulness courses to try and really capture this one. And so if you can capture that noticing and choose to respond according to your values, when somebody is bringing in a really tricky kind of, oh my God, why are they asking me this again? Then great, because that will definitely be an opportunity to really assist that person rather than undermine them. The other is that idea to rest, re-energize, renew, to moment by moment, looking across all elements of your life. So the big stuff, but also within your day, you take those pauses as well. And being good enough is where it's at. Perfection is positively toxic and it slows you down, right? We give ourselves unrelenting standards. So why not just kind of step back, pause and think, right, okay, what's good enough as a leader here? And I'm okay if I fail in any respect, because as long as I notice it, that I can rectify that one. So a bit of self-compassion is always worth bringing in. Genuine empathy, and we all know when people aren't being authentic in terms of their communication style. So make things explicit, but also authentic in terms of offering genuine empathy, stepping into that person's shoes and adapting to your communication and being visible wherever possible. Creating opportunities for people to influence and control, obviously within the spectrum of what's there for you in terms of the kind of the work tasks, but giving them some degree of influence where's possible in terms of choices, and share and evolve leadership. Nothing of this will be new. Anybody who's familiar with the key kind of self-awareness leadership ideals will be aware of this. But also watch for fatigue and burnout. This is all unexpected. We've never done this before. We've not got a rule book to say, oh, do this or do that, or to expect this, other than just notice. We are doing something extraordinary and coming back into the workplace for notice fatigue. And I know that Lisa will bring that up later. But also that idea of focusing on what matters. There's the potential with the kind of the energy of coming back into the workplace to kind of just lose sight of what's core and lose sight of those boundaries that are there for a reason to keep us kind of focused in what we're doing. So I'll start to bring things to a close now by mentioning also the pause to choose how to respond, align with your values. And up here, I've popped in an opportunity to use Mentimeter, which is software that many of you will be familiar with. Just use a QR code. It'll take you through to a voting where you just put in what are your top 3 values that underpin your leadership style. Your values are really what matters to you. It's what you wrap yourself around as a person. It's your compass in terms of how you want to be. So what we thought, we'd pop that up there. We're not going to show the results at the moment. You'll be able to see them in a couple of days, and Adam will send them as a take-home message as well. And then also in terms of, again, QR code for you to look at again is don't lose sight of what is a caring conversation, right? And what you can bring to those conversations in terms of, and I know that you know this, but in the midst of all sorts of things, we lose sight of it, where we have to be connecting, we have to be curious, we have to be collaborative, and we have to have compromise as well. So I'll leave that up there, QR code, you'll get it in your takeaways, but don't dismiss it, have a read and see what you can take from it, because it talks about the dimension, but then it also very usefully gives you questions that you can ask or where you frame statements. And then the next bit is really that idea very briefly about how you bring a team back together again. So team resilience is actual fact, it's not necessarily all about the individuals in the team, it's about the leadership around the team. And that's carefully cultivated by your leadership style. So the 4 things that resilient teams do is, and this will have been kind of wobbled in all sorts of ways over the year, where albeit we've been Teams and Zoom and what have you, we've not necessarily been sitting around a table together. And that's where some of the dynamics will start playing out. So the 4th thing, have in mind, remember, you've got to help them believe that they can effectively achieve things together, that they have a clear idea on the same page in terms of what their roles and responsibilities with everyday challenges as well as adversity. They can improvise, they can handle, they can develop new ideas, and they also trust each other, that they trust each other again. Okay. They may not have lost it, but always just be watchful for how that translates as they move. Last things. 1, the BPS has produced, so that's my professional body, the British Psychological Society. They came out with the most extraordinary table that if you can get hold of, and it will be in our takeaway, they talked about the preparation stage in terms of COVID, the active stage, and then the recovery stage. And there, it's worth actually just reading. Most people do cope successfully, but they do need the support. They can need the support to do it in their preferred style, where they're recovering and coming back in to the workplace. And it can be done. It just needs some sensitivity, and the idea of this potential for post-traumatic growth is always there. So be mindful of that. And also, you'll possibly be already aware that the CIPD have done a phenomenal pack in terms of how to help your employees return to the workplace. And I'm sorry if I've overrun. I can't see any indication of the chat. And Stephen, you've been so courteous in terms of saying, "Shut up, Lesley." So I hope that's being clear. And that's me.
You're actually bang on time, Lesley. So that's absolutely perfect. Thank you. That was really fascinating. And I think I was so glad we did that poll with you as well, because how interesting to see that the big concern is not necessarily actually about the workplace and safety in the workplace. It's about the home and what you're leaving behind. And for a lot of people watching this, maybe, who their employee is something that arrives fully formed in the workplace for them, and they don't really need to think too much about what goes on at home. The past year has changed all of that. Home and work now are inextricably linked, aren't they?
Indeed, indeed. And I think that's the other thing, is that is to be mindful of what's not being too visible as yet and isn't playing out yet. It'll be when people are starting to come in, literally the day before or the week before, or actually when they're in the door, that some of the difficulties might become more apparent. And I know that Lisa's got some excellent stuff lined up to kind of help to support your employees as far as that's concerned.
Lesley, thank you so much. We'll hear more from Lesley a little bit later when we go to the Q&A session. So we've got questions coming in now. Just a reminder, just use that Q&A button you can see in the bottom of your screen. Type your questions in. We'll pull them up and we'll work through them with Lesley and Lisa at the end of our session. So our next speaker this afternoon, Lisa Evans, occupational therapist at Maggie's in Manchester. She joins us by the magic of Zoom from there tonight to talk us through how we can prepare for that return to work. Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. Really interesting to hear the results of the poll as well. So hopefully I'll remember to touch on that at the end. But yeah, I just wanted to get you to start to think about maybe that preparing for the return to the workplace. I'm sure you're doing that already. But one of the things that might be really helpful to start to think about is the individual, so the individual employee within the context of their environment. And I guess, you know, today we're really talking or focusing on the work environment. And what I would say is that's not just the physical environment. So we might be thinking about people moving back into a physical space like an office, but the environment is so much more than that. So I know Lesley just touched on the importance of teams, and I would really see that sort of the team, the employer, the organisation, the company, and even the industry within which you work are all sort of part of that that wider environment. And the employee exists within that. So there's really an interaction. So starting to think about the individual in relation to that environment, but also their individual work role within that environment and the individual tasks and activities that make up work role, and that is going to be really, really different for you across your organisations, depending on, you know, the industry you're in. But that could also be very, very different within even a very small workspace, depending on the roles that people have. And when we think about work role, again, as an occupational therapist, I'm really thinking about the functional demands that a work role has on people. So we can start to break that down into the physical demands, the cognitive demands, so the sort of brain processes, you know, things like concentration, memory, problem solving, the psychological demands, and I guess at the minute one of the biggies, or what we're assuming one of the big things is going to be, is the social demands of the work role. So things we may never have really had to consider too much before, but having been out of that environment, that actually may really start to test our social skills, and we've not particularly been in any other social environments either. So yeah, just keeping that in mind, and I guess within that, really important to remember that the elements of somebody's work role that they find particularly stressful or equally maybe particularly rewarding, but just focusing on maybe the stressful and demanding just now, are very, very different for different people. So what one person really thrives on might be incredibly stressful for somebody else. So it's just worth thinking about that sort of skills and resources of your individual team members versus the demands of their role. And those roles may be similar to how they were before, but the person may be different, or the role may be very different, and they might have need a different skill set. So just again, sort of trying to keep that in mind. So when either preparing ourselves for return to the workplace or maybe supporting other people, it can be really helpful to do something that I would call like a role analysis, a sort of job role analysis. And what it can help to do is maybe anticipate any potential areas of challenge for an individual. And what that allows you to do is start to think about putting some things in place to actually support people back into the workplace and maybe minimise some of the stress that might be caused. So not knowing what all your individual workplace roles are, I've done an example of my work role here at Maggie's Manchester as a cancer support specialist. So we should be able to just get that on screen. And you can do this in sort of as little or as much detail as you like, but it's really helpful to do it. I often work with people affected by cancer, and they'll come into the centre and say, I've done nothing today, but they have done something because they're here and they're dressed and they've got here somehow, and you know, they've travelled here. So it's just really interesting to actually start to think about, what does going to work involve? And I know in the poll it was interesting because the commute was something that was one of the highest scores, wasn't it, in terms of things people might be concerned about. I'm reasonably lucky, as you'll see on mine. I've got a reasonably short commute. So again, each person's will be different, but just starting to break the day down into the individual activities and tasks, and also starting to think about what is the demand of those individual activities and tasks. So back to that physical demand, cognitive demand, psychological demand, emotional demands, social demands. So that's just to give you an idea. I think I've got a second screen that just will take me through into the afternoon. Just get that up, lovely. So again, just seeing a lot of my work is very flexible because of the nature of my role, although there are some concrete bits within it. So this could look incredibly different for different people depending on the role. And then just moving into that third PowerPoint. What's really helpful to do at the end is then to start to think about within that, what's the challenges for the individual, back to that individuality of people. So my role is unpredictable often. It takes a huge amount of energy, often managing multiple people at the same time, and therefore a lot of social demand. And one of the big things for me when I came back into the workplace was virtual stuff, Zoom, Teams, running relaxation, facilitating support groups. And you know, I have a real nervousness around IT letting me down. So really, you know, starting to recognise what is it within my work role that might particularly cause me concern or stress, or may just have more of a demand. And then starting to think with that, is there anything we could do to adapt to help meet the demands for the individual? And we'll touch a little bit more. We'll touch a little bit more on that. But I guess the key thing is any activity in life can be broken down in these terms. You know, that's really what occupational therapists do. It's not just work as an occupation, but every aspect, every role that we have within our lives. And we can break down the individual tasks, but we also need to think of the whole working day. So we might have tasks within the day. We need to think of the day as a whole. We also need to think of the week as a whole. So as human beings, we often will wonder why we're tired on a Wednesday, not considering what we might have done on a Tuesday. So that within the context of the day, the individual within the day, within the whole of the day, and then within the week. And by doing that and understanding people's roles and maybe our own roles, we can start to think about whether we can adapt them in any way. So, for example, can the activity be adapted to make it less demanding or more achievable? And that could literally be anything. So that might be staggered starts. It might be going into the office at a time when maybe public transport might be quieter. It might be having smaller groups in the office at a time. It might be having split lunch breaks, so not everybody's around just at the same time. It could be literally anything, but can the activity be changed in any way to make it more doable, if you like, for an individual or for the team in the workspace? And as well as the activity, again, thinking about, can the environment be changed in any way? Lesley referenced about noise and sensory overload, and that I would predict will be really demanding on people returning to a workplace. So yeah, it might be having a quiet area that you've never needed before, like a breakout room where people can just go, where it's actually there might be some access to relaxation music or herbal teas, or maybe access to an outdoor space. So really starting to think is, can we adapt the activity? Can we change the environment? And also, if sometimes there's nothing you can do about those things, they're sort of fairly concrete. And so therefore then thinking about how can we change maybe how the individual responds, and that really links back into the work Lesley's talked about, but thinking about the coping of an individual and how they function, and can we maybe do some things that are going to help them both as an individual but also as a team. And those things I can't really run through with you just now, because they really, really will depend on the what comes up in the role analysis, if you like. However, I will predict, for me, and you may agree with this, you may not agree with it. You'll have your own experiences because of the workplaces that you're in. But one of the things I would like to say is social situations can be incredibly exhausting. They just demand so much of us, and it's one of the things we often underestimate. And equally, change can be incredibly exhausting. Hence why routines can be really helpful, because they take less from us. So just thinking back to, I was really interested on the poll that I think the length of the working day and the stamina to get through it was maybe one of the lowest scoring elements of that. I'd be interested to see how that pans out, because I think this will be a really physically and psychologically quite tiring process. So I just keep that in mind. And the other thing that I'd like to say, which links into that work-home balance, is some of the things that help keep us really well as individuals. So I would talk about activities that we do that keep us well, that we do because they're good for us. Some of those have been really inaccessible for the last 12 months, and some of those things still aren't happening. So really, really important to recognise that, because people don't just exist within the work context, they do exist outside of that. You know, it's one element of their life, but they exist, you know, they're part of a wider world and multiple other roles. So yeah, just trying to see that individual within the workplace, but then putting them back in the context of their wider life and the impact that can have. And I think that's probably the key points I wanted to get across. Hopefully that's been helpful to start to think about.
Lisa, thank you so much for that. Lesley, come back and join us on screen. We've got questions coming in for you both. Keep them coming just using the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom. And we've got about 15, 20 minutes as planned to work through some of them. That was really, really useful from you both in terms of prep for getting back, but also once you're back there as well. Can I ask you both a question to help a friend of mine, actually, who has worked throughout the pandemic? It's not me, honestly, but he's worked throughout the pandemic and he's exhausted. And colleagues have been on furlough and are now coming back into the workplace and telling tales of having learned Spanish, done couch to 5K, had a puppy, reconnected with family in a way that he has not been able to do. And if he's honest about it, there's a resentment there about that. How can you deal with this kind of twin track approach, which we've seen in many larger workplaces? And how can we minimize the resentment and increase the understanding of the problems that both have faced throughout of this? Lesley, maybe you first on that. What do you think?
It's really interesting, and I think it's worth highlighting that twin track. The starting point is not easy. It's actually, the starting point is observing and being open to everybody. Everybody's experience is acceptable. It is that just their response, and that resentfulness when you hear and that people are coming back and looking so much fresher, so much less stressed, so much more rounded potentially, and also you being there kind of holding things together. But likewise, the person coming in from furlough is potentially coming into a situation where people have bonded in a very, very kind of firm and supportive way. Those people who weren't on furlough have been talking with themselves, each other, have connected with each other, quite rightly so, such that they've actually found a way in which they can actually progress and deal with the stresses that they've encountered. My response to this, and I'd love to hear Lisa's comments as well, is the need to be open around it, and to where possible give space for people to voice it separately, and then potentially voice it together. And also on a very practical note, it's like, what does this tell us about the space for sabbatical and the space for giving people, like, okay, let's look at the annual leave situation, because that's one of the things when you're coming in from furlough, you've still got your annual leave, and yet the people who are needing the leave potentially are competing with those people from furlough to actually get it. But likewise, those people on furlough have had to sign forms where it's said that in essence your job is potentially dispensable, that you could be made redundant, and that they have had to cope with perhaps potentially less of a salary. So I think both of those arenas have to be aired, and if that starts individually, that's fine. If you can bring it together in the idea of building that team and that productive way forward, that would be extra special. But I'm fascinated to hear what Lisa's got to say, and indeed, Stephen, what your thoughts are in our responses.
Yeah, Lisa, when you go.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think there's some stuff about this within the psychology document, Lesley. I'm sure you're aware, but I think you only ever see a snapshot. So I think, or you hear a snapshot, and I think the challenges for both groups that there have been. So, you know, for some people, although you might hear about the, you know, the highlights, if you like, of you know, maybe home working, I think that there can be quite a lot of, certainly from conversations I've had, you know, real difficulties with lack of structure, being tied to the house, not having the rewards of a normal working day. And so I think it can be sometimes easy to not see behind the sort of just what's up front. So if those conversations can happen, great. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of people who have, it's maybe been a different challenge. So the energy to keep in work during all that period and being exhausted, I think hopefully that will be acknowledged by the employer. You know, that's something that I would hope. And I think if you can have those conversations, so that everybody can maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of how that's been. And I guess, again, for different people, thinking back to that stress demands, resources sort of analogy, that might be helpful to think about, because for some people it might have been great, but for other people it might have been terrible, both ways. And it might be thinking about, you know, if there is a real level of fatigue, because there will be in particular industries as well, I'm sure, is maybe, you know, employers starting to think a little bit more about what they can put in place to support people. So that might be things like relaxation sessions, it might be around managing energy, it might be around, if you know they can't do what normally keeps them well, what else can we do? And just trying to really build that that support, because if somebody is well in their role, they're going to be much more effective. So it's to everybody's benefit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad we talked about this. Amanda is saying, my team experienced the twin track, lots of hostility. I was furloughed. I felt very detached when I returned. And Liz is saying everyone's had dealt with this differently. It's something we all need to be mindful of. And yeah, I think that's a really good point by Amanda, that, you know, it may all look rosy for people returning from furlough, but they have a lot of catch up to do. And they've been sitting with a lot of worry, Lesley, about actually, is my role going to be there the longer furlough goes on?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what Lisa's saying there is, let's not make assumptions. Let's get an opportunity to actually have people air just what has been going on for them, not necessarily publicly, but just so that you can actually start building the team together with a kind of an open and passionate. I don't mean that in a kind of whimsical way. It's kind of like, let's be open. Let's consider, each of us have had a particular challenge in that track. How can we offset the challenge for those people who have been there? But that detachment, I think, is really, really important. People might be coming into cliques which were not there before, and are kind of like, well, we've been getting on with it, and that kind of othering, and that is not going to be helpful in terms of the challenges ahead. So I think it's worth us taking time to do that one, and but also the exhaustion is, how can you be creative around people just needing to stop sometimes, and be mindful of that before they have to break down and tell you, to a certain degree.
Yeah, well, here's a really good question on that. I now find a full working day in the office exhausting. What advice do you have for me to manage this? I'm happy to be back in, but by 3 o'clock, I'm exhausted. I'm wanting to be going home. A shorter working day is not an option in the role that I have. Lisa, what would your suggestions be around that, when the working pattern at home has been different, the commute is now in there as well, all those things that you talked about that just leave you at the end of the day, well, not even at the end of the day, mid-afternoon, done in?
I'd say consider timing, because what you might find is when you're back in, you know, once you've been back in a little while, so we might do like phase returns when people have been off, to actually slowly build that up. It sounds like that might not be an option in this case, but that's certainly something worth considering. The other thing I would say is, don't be too hard on yourself. You know, it is demanding. I think if you think back to that sort of the breakdown that I did earlier, it's incredibly demanding on so many levels, but there may be some flexibility within the day itself. So the sorts of things that I would be thinking about: does everything have to be done today? Does everything that I'm doing in my working day have to be done today? And if it does, then maybe speaking to your manager about, can we look, or as a team, can we look at this? I might have activities that I find incredibly demanding energy-wise. So if somebody else doesn't, it might be about maybe a little bit of swapping activities between people. You know, somebody might thrive off something that I find really stressful, and vice versa. So there may be stuff to do around that. There may be an option to, I don't know how long your lunch break is, but you can adjust things. So sometimes if you've got an hour's lunch break, or we have half an hour, can you have a mid-morning break, a mid-afternoon break, and a shorter lunch break, just so you've actually got something peppered through the day rather than it all being in one go? Is there any option to do something when you leave the office, so you can maybe leave a little bit earlier and have a break? It's just really trying to think about what has to be done, because certain things, what has to be done, and what has to be done in a particular way, and then anything else, would any movement of that, would any adaptation of that make it easier? And sometimes, you know, there are things that unfortunately will continue to be really challenging, but I really feel there's nearly always something that might help. But I certainly think a conversation, and I think that acknowledgement, I don't know for that particular person if that's been acknowledged in the workplace, if people have realised how demanding it is in terms of energy. And the risk there is you then go home exhausted and you lose that work life, you lose that balance, and that you then lose the resourcing of your personal life, which helps you. So you don't want to be doing just all the musts and shoulds. You want to be doing some of the stuff you like to do as well. It keeps us well.
Just a follow-up to that for you, Lesley. Same person is asking, actually, is this exhaustion, this 3 o'clock exhaustion, is it something that will go away as I get used to being back? And if so, how long will it take to build up the stamina to do the old 9 to 5, 10 to 6, or whatever it is again?
I think if you put some of the kind of the wise ideas that Lisa's just said into place, they don't have to be forever. They are very much that kind of phase return. If somebody's coming in from being off sick for a period of time, we give them a phase return of some description and kind of review that. So any systems, any kind of breakdowns of the day that you put in place at the beginning doesn't have to be a forever. It can be a review. And the idea of that, building up that exhaustion, if I can use kind of just experience from the clinical work that I do, sometimes what happens is that the exhaustion is so unexpected that then people become anxious around the exhaustion, right? And they're doing things which is actually going to help the exhaustion. And what they're left with is this burden of anxiety of my head working like treacle. I'm not good at this anymore. I can't do that. I can't find the words. I can't. Is it? And so in actual fact, the exhaustion has the exhaustion has kind of phased out, but they're left with an overlay of anxiety. And I think one of the ways to offset that is to expect it. Yeah. If you're feeling exhausted at 3 o'clock, if your head is treacle, that is not forever. Right, it's a trigger to say, right, I need to flag that one up. It is not a vulnerability. It's not a weakness. It's in actual fact, my main way of actually sorting this out is by flagging it up and finding temporary ways in which my colleagues or my manager can help me in this one. Okay, and also where possible, the manager's saying, look, trust us, there is no problem in terms of your job security. And I think that's a hard one for us to say, but it's definitely one thing that most people, if they hear that, they calm down. So
that's really good advice from you both. Let's go to something else here. Question, I wonder how many workplaces will actually be sympathetic towards the returning workforce. Since we've been all in this together, there'll be an expectation for us to just get on with it together now, potentially as well. I think a lot of people would be reluctant to admit they are struggling. So maybe on that point of the attitude from employers and why it's important for them to recognise what we've been talking about. And I'd also be really interested to hear from you both, what are the signs employers, because not everyone is good at asking for help. What are the signs that employers should be looking out for to realise that people are really struggling with this return? Lisa, what would you think first?
I think the first thing is to maybe expect it. You know, I would expect somebody, you know, if I take it back to my day-to-day work, I would be expecting that on a return to work, that all of that this was going to be really challenging for somebody, even with adaptations put in place. So I think for me, it's the employer sort of, if somebody copes with it incredibly, you know, without a difficulty, great, but the expectation that these things are challenging. So maybe for me, it's starting at that point that this is likely to challenge people, and having forums, and that might be different forums, because as you say, not everybody might speak up. There may be multiple ways of checking in with people, or allowing people to feedback in a less, you know, especially if they're feeling vulnerable. And there are some tools available. Mine do an excellent sort of I think they call it a wellness action plan, which is produced, and you can sign up for that online and download the document as an individual, and it's really geared for people through Mind with mental health problems, but it's very adaptable to this sort of situation. And again, that's something an individual might reflect on, and then think about a way in which they can engage, and maybe speak to somebody else about that. So I just think having as many forums or opportunities to allow people to share their concerns, because I think the other thing is, when, I don't know, Lesley will probably have more to say, when people feel really vulnerable, it is really hard to voice, and that might be vulnerable around how they're feeling, but it also might be that job vulnerability about the sort of employment.
I mean, there's not much I can add to what Lisa said. It's brilliant. We spoke beforehand, and we were trying to track down really kind of accessible material, and that Mind well-being plan was one thing that was flagged up, albeit coming from a mental health angle. It's absolutely spot on for all of us in terms of going forward. If I can just touch on that idea of we're all in it together, right? Human beings, we're tribal, we're social beings, and in actual fact, there is merit in that all be in it together. So as long as we take the default, as Lisa said, in that assume that people are going to find the transition tricky in some ways, and be really happy when some aren't, but also use the idea that there will be an element of post-traumatic growth that will be there. People will be energized in all sorts of different ways, having gone through this, because that is very much the natural human default. So let's look for it and see how that starts to play out as we can start kind of re-engaging with those things that bring vibrancy to our life again. And people getting used to the idea of, oh my God, I'm really enjoying being in the workplace again. I'm enjoying seeing people across there, and let's be excited about that and curious about how that plays out.
Thank you. Amanda says, I'm letting my team come into the office in the afternoons to help their anxiety. Travel's lighter, commute home isn't as bad as the commute in. This is slowly encouraging my team to come in. What a great idea. Somehow we've magically managed to run out of time this afternoon. It's coming up to 3 o'clock. So I'd just like to say, Lisa and Lesley, thank you so much. So many helpful tools there for us to take away, insights, just things to think about, sensitivities around all of this, and that message that has run through this whole thing about just being kind to each other and thinking about each other and being open, I think has shone through from you both this afternoon. Thank you so much for your expertise that you brought to us all this afternoon. I hope you watching this have felt it's been a useful hour. Thanks also to the behind the scenes team at Maggie's who made this possible, to Adam, Sam and Jackie, and of course to the people Postcode Lottery for their brilliant and continuing support and partnership on this. As I say, Maggie's absolutely depend on these partners to do what they do. Thank you for being with us this afternoon and for supporting Maggie's, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.